I learned to carry grief the way other women carried fans or reticules, tucked close to the body where no one could see it trembling. The day I arrived at Thornfield Manor as companion to the Dowager Duchess, I wore my mourning blacks and my silence like armor, and I told myself that survival was enough. I had lost my husband to fever, my home to creditors, and my place in society to the whispers that followed a widow with no fortune and a young daughter to raise. The world had made its judgment clear. I was to be grateful for any position that kept us from the workhouse, and I was to ask for nothing more. Thornfield Manor rose from the moors like a stone rebuke to softness, all gray towers and narrow windows that seemed to watch rather than welcome. The Duke of Ravensmere resided there when he was not in London, and his reputation arrived in the servants' quarters long before I ever glimpsed his face. Cold, they said, unforgiving. A man who had loved his wife with such fierce possession that her death 2 years prior had turned him to ice. The staff moved through the halls with the careful quiet of those who feared to disturb a sleeping beast, and I understood that my survival here would depend on remaining invisible, on asking nothing, on disturbing no one. My daughter Clara was 6 years old, with her father's gentle eyes and a heart too tender for the world we now inhabited. I had explained to her, as best I could, that we must be quiet in this house, that we must not draw attention, that her laughter must be kept soft, and her questions saved for when we were alone in our small room at the top of the east wing. She tried, in the way children try when they love their mothers and sense the weight pressing down. But children are creatures of honesty, and grief has a way of slipping past even the most careful guard. It happened on a gray afternoon in late autumn, when the fog pressed against the windows like something living, and the fires in the grates could not quite chase away the cold that lived in the stones themselves. I had been reading to the Dowager in her sitting room, a Gothic novel she favored for its tales of haunted abbeys and doomed love, when the headache came upon me with such sudden violence that I could barely see the words on the page. I excused myself with apologies, my voice steady even as my vision blurred, and made my way upstairs to lie down in the darkness of my room. I did not mean to weep. I had trained myself against it, had learned to press my grief down into some locked chamber of my heart where it could not escape and humiliate me. But the pain in my head merged with the pain I carried always, and in the privacy of that small room, I allowed myself the weakness of tears, silent tears, the kind that come without sound, but tears nonetheless. I pressed my face into the pillow and told myself it would pass, that I would compose myself and return to my duties, and no one would ever know. But Clara had come looking for me, worried as children are when their mothers disappear. She must have heard something, or perhaps she simply knew the way children know when the one person who holds their world together is breaking. I did not hear her small footsteps in the hall. I did not hear her pause outside my door, deciding what to do. What I learned later, from whispers and wide-eyed accounts from the housekeeper, was that Clara had gone downstairs, had wandered through corridors she had been told to avoid, and had found her way to the Duke's study. The Duke himself was there, conducting correspondence with his steward, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the county. And my daughter, with the terrible innocence of childhood, had approached him directly. "Sir," she had said, in that clear voice children use before the world teaches them to be afraid, "my mamma is weeping upstairs." The study had gone silent. The steward had frozen, horrified at the intrusion. The servants in the hall had held their breath, waiting for the Duke's displeasure to descend like winter frost. Everyone in that house knew that the Duke of Ravensmere did not tolerate disruption, did not suffer the presence of children, had in fact forbidden them from the main floors entirely after his wife's death. My heart, when I heard this account hours later, nearly stopped beating. I knew we would be dismissed, that my one chance to keep Clara fed and sheltered had been destroyed by a child's honest concern. But the Duke had not dismissed us. He had not raged or sent Clara away with cold words. Instead, he had done something no one in that manor expected. He had risen from his desk, this man they called heartless, and he had walked upstairs to find me. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hendricks, told me later that his face had held an expression she had not seen in 2 years, something almost human beneath the ice. He had climbed those servants' stairs himself, had walked down that narrow corridor where the gentry never ventured, and he had knocked on my door. I had scrambled to compose myself, to dry my face and smooth my dress, terror coursing through me as I opened the door to find him standing there. The Duke of Ravensmere was tall and dark-haired, with features that might have been handsome if they had not been set in such perpetual severity. His eyes were gray as the moors in winter, and they saw too much. I knew he could see the evidence of my tears, could see the fear in my face, could see everything I had tried so hard to hide. I expected condemnation. I expected to be told to pack my things and leave before nightfall. Instead, he had spoken in a voice that was low and careful, as though he feared to startle me. He asked if I was unwell. He asked if I required a physician. And when I stammered that I was merely tired, that I would return to my duties immediately, he had done something even more unexpected. He had told me to rest. He had told me that the dowager would not require me for the remainder of the day. And then, before I could form words to respond, he had turned and walked away, taking Clara gently by the hand to return her to our room, murmuring something to her that made her smile. I stood in that doorway long after he disappeared down the corridor, my heart beating against my ribs like something wild and confused. The Duke of Ravensmere had shown me kindness, more than kindness. He had shown me a glimpse of something I thought had died with my husband, something I had no right to feel and no hope of keeping. He had shown me that beneath the ice there was still a man capable of compassion. And in that moment, standing alone in the gathering dusk, I understood that I was in far greater danger than I had ever imagined, not from cruelty or dismissal, but from the terrible, foolish hope that had just taken root in my chest, fragile as a winter rose and just as certain to die in the cold. The days that followed moved with the strange, slow weight of a dream from which I could not quite wake. I returned to my duties with the dowager, reading to her from novels and correspondence, accompanying her on short walks through the conservatory when the weather turned too bitter for the gardens. She was a woman of sharp observation and few words, and I felt her watching me with an intensity that made my hands tremble when I poured her tea. She never mentioned what had happened, never asked why her son had climbed the servants' stairs or why Clara had dared to disturb him in his study. But her silence felt deliberate, as though she were waiting to see what I would do next. The Duke himself had returned to his usual reserve, conducting business in his study, riding out across the moors in the early mornings when fog still clung to the heather. I caught glimpses of him in corridors, in doorways, always at a distance that felt carefully maintained. Yet something had shifted. When our paths crossed, his nod of acknowledgement lasted a fraction longer than propriety required. When I attended dinner to keep the dowager company, I felt his gaze settle on me across the candle-lit table with a weight that made it difficult to swallow my food. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that a man of his position and reputation could have no possible interest in a widowed companion with nothing to recommend her but desperation and a child to support. I told myself that kindness, however unexpected, did not constitute affection, and that I was a fool to let my heart beat faster when I heard his footsteps in the hall. But the heart is a treacherous thing, and mine had been lonely for so long. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Hendricks, who first spoke to me of the late Duchess. She came to my room one evening as I was putting Clara to bed, bringing fresh linens that I suspected were merely an excuse for conversation. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who had learned to navigate troubled waters. She was very beautiful, Mrs. Hendricks said quietly, folding the linens with practiced efficiency. The Duchess, I mean, Lady Catherine, fair-haired and gentle, always laughing. His Grace adored her beyond reason. When she died, it was as though something in him died as well. I listened, my hand stilling on the coverlet where Clara slept. I did not ask how the Duchess had died. Something in Mrs. Hendricks's tone suggested the answer would bring more questions than comfort. She fell, Mrs. Hendricks continued, her voice dropping even lower, from the gallery on the 3rd floor, late at night, when everyone was sleeping. His Grace found her at dawn, at the bottom of the stairs. They said it was an accident, that she had been walking in her sleep. But there were those who wondered. Wondered what? I asked, though part of me did not want to know. Mrs. Hendricks met my eyes with an expression I could not quite read. whether it was truly an accident or whether she had reasons to seek the darkness. She had been unwell, you see. Melancholy. The doctors called it a nervous condition. His Grace tried everything to help her, brought specialists from London, from Edinburgh, but she only grew more withdrawn, more troubled. Some nights the maids heard her weeping. Other nights they heard her speaking to someone in her room, though she was quite alone. A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the draught from the window. I thought of the corridors of Thornfield Manor, the way they seemed to hold whispers in their shadows, the way certain rooms felt colder than others, despite the fires that burned in their grates. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Mrs. Hendricks asked me suddenly. I hesitated. My husband had been a practical man, a man of accounts and daylight certainties, but I had felt things since his death that I could not explain. Presences in empty rooms. The sense of being watched when I knew myself to be alone. "I believe," I said carefully, "that grief can make us feel the presence of those we have lost, whether that is the dead returning or our own hearts refusing to let them go. I cannot say." Mrs. Hendricks nodded slowly. "Some of the staff have seen her," she said. "The Duchess, or something that looks like her. A figure in white moving through the gallery at night. His Grace forbids talk of it. He says it is foolishness and superstition. But I have heard things myself. Footsteps where no one walks, doors closing when the halls are empty. And once, just once, I saw her, or thought I did, standing at the window of her old room, looking out at the moors. She left shortly after that, taking the folded linens with her, and I sat in the dimness, listening to Clara's soft breathing and trying to calm the unease that had settled in my chest. I did not believe in hauntings. I did not believe that the dead could return to trouble the living, but I believed in sorrow, and in the way it could poison a house until the very stones seemed to hold it. The next morning, I encountered the Duke in the library. I had gone there to select a new novel for the Dowager, and I found him standing at the window overlooking the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile sharp against the gray light. He turned when he heard me enter, and for a moment we simply looked at each other across the leather-bound silence. "Lady Ashford," he said, and his voice held a formality that felt like distance deliberately imposed. "I trust you are well." "I am, Your Grace. Thank you." I hesitated, then added, "I wish to thank you again for your kindness. It was not necessary, but it was deeply appreciated." Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to name. "Kindness should not be remarkable," he said quietly. "It should be expected. I regret that this household has become a place where compassion feels like transgression." The words hung between us. Heavy with meaning, I was afraid to examine too closely. I could have left then. I should have left. But instead, I heard myself speaking, my voice soft but steady. "Mrs. Hendricks tells me you lost your wife. I am sorry for your grief." His expression hardened instantly, the ice returning to his features. "That was 2 years ago," he said, his tone cold enough to frost glass. "I do not require sympathy." I felt the rebuke like a slap, but I did not look away. Grief does not follow a calendar, Your Grace. It does not care whether we think we should be finished with it. It comes when it wishes, and it leaves when it is ready. For a long moment he stared at me, and I saw something in his face that I recognized because I had felt it myself in the dark hours when Clara was sleeping, and I was alone with my memories. He saw that I understood, not from gossip or imagination, but from having walked the same bitter road. "You speak from experience," he said finally, and it was not quite a question. "I am a widow, Your Grace. My husband has been gone 3 years. There are days when it feels like yesterday, and days when I can barely remember his face. Grief is not a straight path. It circles back on itself when we least expect it." He turned back to the window, his shoulders tense beneath his dark coat. "They tell you it gets easier," he said, so quietly I almost did not hear him. "They tell you time will heal it, but time only teaches you to carry it better. The weight never lessens." "No," I agreed softly. "It does not." We stood there in silence, 2 people bound by loss and loneliness, and I felt the air between us shift into something dangerous and necessary. When he looked at me again, his eyes held a question he did not speak aloud, and I knew that whatever was beginning between us would lead to either salvation or ruin, and I could not tell which I wanted more. I began to see her 3 nights later. Or perhaps I had been seeing her all along and had only just allowed myself to acknowledge what my eyes had been trying to tell me. It was past midnight when I woke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside my room. Soft, measured footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth with deliberate care. I lay still in the darkness, listening to Clara's gentle breathing from her small bed across the room, and told myself it was merely a servant attending to some late duty. But the footsteps continued, back and forth, with a rhythm that spoke of distress rather than purpose. I rose finally, wrapping my shawl around my shoulders against the cold, and opened my door as quietly as I could manage. The corridor was empty. The lamp at the far end cast long shadows across the floorboards, and the air held that peculiar stillness that belongs to the deep hours of night. Yet I could still hear the footsteps, fainter now, moving away toward the main staircase. I followed them. I cannot explain why, except that something in their cadence called to me, lonely and lost. I made my way down the servants' stairs and through the passages that led to the family wing, moving through shadows and moonlight that spilled through tall windows. The footsteps led me to the third floor, to the gallery Mrs. Hendricks had mentioned, where the late Duchess had fallen to her death. The gallery was long and narrow, lined with portraits of Ravensmere ancestors who stared down with painted eyes that seemed to follow my movement. At the far end, near the window that overlooked the front drive, I saw her, a figure in white, standing perfectly still, her back to me, her pale hair catching the moonlight like spider silk. My heart seized in my chest. I knew I should turn and flee, should return to my room and lock the door and tell myself I had dreamed it. But I found myself moving forward instead, drawn by something I could not name. As I drew closer, I could see that she was wearing a nightgown, old-fashioned in its cut, and that her feet were bare against the cold floor. She stood so still she might have been carved from marble. "Lady Catherine," I whispered, though I do not know what made me speak her name. The figure turned slowly, and I saw her face. It was beautiful and terrible at once, pale as death, with eyes that held such infinite sadness I felt tears spring to my own. She looked at me for a long moment, and I understood in that instant that she was trying to tell me something, trying to communicate some truth that death had not released her from speaking. Then she stepped backward, toward the railing where she had fallen, and my voice broke from my paralysis. "No," I cried out, reaching toward her. "Please, do not." But she was already gone, vanished as though she had never been there at all, leaving only the cold air and the hammer of my heart, and the certainty that I had just witnessed something that should not exist. I do not remember returning to my room. I remember standing in that gallery until the trembling in my limbs subsided, and then finding myself back in my bed, Clara still sleeping peacefully, as though nothing had disturbed the night at all. When morning came, I told myself it had been a dream brought on by Mrs. Hendricks's stories and my own exhausted mind. But my bare feet were cold and dirty, and I knew I had walked those corridors in more than sleep. I said nothing of it to anyone. What could I say that would not make me sound mad? Yet the vision haunted me through the following days, that beautiful, sorrowful face, and the desperate way she had looked at me, as though begging me to understand something I was too blind to see. The Duke began to seek me out with increasing frequency. He would find me in the library, in the conservatory, in the music room where I sometimes played the piano in the evenings when my duties were finished. Our conversations grew longer, more intimate. He spoke of his childhood, of the weight of his title, and the loneliness of his position. I spoke of my marriage, of the joy and then the grief, of the terror of finding myself alone with a child to protect and no means to do so. He never touched me, never spoke words that crossed the boundary of propriety, but there was something in the way he looked at me, in the way his voice softened when he said my name, that made it clear our connection had moved beyond mere sympathy between two grieving souls. I felt it growing between us like a living thing, dangerous and necessary, and I did not know how to stop it or whether I wanted to. It was the dowager who finally confronted me. She summoned me to her sitting room one afternoon, dismissed her maid with a gesture, and fixed me with eyes that saw far too much. "You must be very careful, Lady Ashford," she said without preamble. "My son is not a man who gives his heart lightly. When he lost Catherine, I feared he would never recover. I feared he would lock himself away from all feeling forever. But I see the way he looks at you now, and I recognize that look. It is how he looked at her, before the darkness took her. "Your Grace," I began, but she raised a hand to silence me. "I do not blame you," she continued. "You have done nothing wrong, but you must understand what you would be walking into. Catherine's death was not the simple accident that society believes it to be. She was deeply troubled in her final months. She heard voices, saw things that were not there. She became convinced that something evil lived in this house, something that wanted to harm her. The doctors called it melancholy, but I am not certain they were right. I felt cold creeping through me. "What do you believe it was?" I asked quietly. The dowager looked toward the window, where rain had begun to streak the glass. "I believe my son's love for her was so consuming, it became a kind of prison. He could not bear to let her out of his sight. He monitored her every movement, her every conversation. He meant it as protection, but Catherine felt it as suffocation. And when she tried to tell him she needed freedom, needed space to breathe, he could not hear her. His fear of losing her blinded him to the fact that his very devotion was pushing her toward the edge." She paused, then looked back at me with an intensity that made me want to look away. "The night she died," they had argued. I heard raised voices from her chambers. She was begging him to let her visit her sister in Bath, to have some time away from Thornfield. He refused. He said he could not protect her if she left, that the world was too dangerous, that she was too fragile. She told him he was smothering her. And then, sometime in the dark hours after he had left her, she fell, or jumped, I whispered, understanding at last. The dowager's face was grave. "We will never know. But my son has carried that question like a stone ever since. If you allow yourself to love him, if you allow him to love you, you must understand what you risk. His heart is not a gentle thing. It is fierce and possessive, and capable of destroying what it seeks to preserve. You have a daughter to think of. Can you take that risk?" I sat in silence, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like a heavy cloak. I thought of the figure in white, of the desperate sadness in those ghostly eyes, of the way she had stepped back toward the railing as though showing me what had happened, warning me. I thought too of the Duke's eyes when he looked at me, of the way my heart lifted when I heard his step in the hall, of the loneliness that had made my life feel like a slow death before I came to this house. I thought of the choice before me, between safety and the possibility of something more, between protecting Clara and allowing myself to live again. "I do not know," I answered honestly, "but I think, Your Grace, that it may already be too late for caution. The heart does not always ask permission before it decides to hope." The dowager smiled then, sad and knowing. "No," she said softly, "it does not. That is its great blessing and its great curse." The truth came to me in pieces, like shards of a broken mirror that I had to fit together before I could see the whole picture. I began to search for it deliberately, no longer content to let the past remain buried. If I was to allow my heart to open to the Duke, if I was to risk everything for the possibility of love, then I needed to know what had truly happened to Catherine Ravensmere. I started in the servants' quarters, speaking quietly with maids who had attended the late Duchess, with footmen who had been present during those final troubled months. They spoke in whispers, glancing over their shoulders as though afraid the Duke might hear them, even through stone walls. They told me of Catherine's increasing isolation, of how the Duke had dismissed her lady's maid and insisted on being the only one to tend to her needs. They told me of locked doors, of meals taken alone in her chambers, of the physician who came weekly and left, shaking his head. One maid, young and frightened, told me she had once heard Catherine crying through the door, begging to see her family, pleading to be allowed to leave the house even for a single afternoon. And she had heard the Duke's voice, gentle but immovable, telling Catherine that he loved her too much to risk losing her, that the world beyond Thornfield was dangerous, that she was safer here where he could protect her. The words chilled me. I thought of the dowager's warning, of the ghost's desperate eyes, of the fine line between devotion and imprisonment. I understood then that Catherine had not been mad. She had been trapped. I found the letters by accident, or perhaps by fate. I was in the library, searching for a volume the Dowager had requested, when a book fell from a high shelf, its pages spilling open to reveal folded papers hidden within. They were letters, written in a woman's delicate hand, addressed to a sister, but never sent. Catherine's letters. I read them with trembling fingers, my heart breaking with each desperate line. "He says he loves me," she had written, "but his love feels like chains. He will not let me breathe. He follows me from room to room. He questions every word I speak. He has taken away my friends, my family, my freedom, all in the name of keeping me safe. I feel as though I am dying by inches, and he cannot see it because he is too busy building walls around me." And in the final letter, dated the day before her death, "I am so tired. I cannot live like this anymore. Tonight, I will try once more to make him understand. If he will not listen, if he will not let me go, then I will find my own way to freedom. I cannot stay in this beautiful prison. I would rather die." I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle the sob that rose in my throat. She had not been mad. She had been suffocating. And the Duke, in his desperate fear of losing her, had driven her to choose death over the life he offered. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find him standing in the doorway, his face pale as he saw what I held in my hands. For a long moment we stared at each other across the chasm of that terrible knowledge. "You found them," he said, his voice hollow. "I have been searching for those letters for 2 years. I did not know she had hidden them." I stood slowly, the letters still clutched in my hand. "Did you know," I asked quietly, "how desperately unhappy she was? Did you know that your love was killing her?" His face contorted with pain. I knew she was troubled. I knew she needed protection. I thought if I could keep her safe, if I could shield her from all harm, she would heal. I thought my love was enough to save her. But she did not want to be saved, I said, and my voice broke. She wanted to be free. She wanted to be trusted. She wanted a husband who saw her as an equal, not a fragile thing to be locked away and guarded. He moved into the room, his movements heavy with grief. "I failed her," he said. "I know that now. I have always known it. The night she died, she begged me to let her visit her sister. She said she needed space, needed air. I refused. I told her I could not bear to have her out of my sight, that something terrible would happen if I let her go. And so she found another way to escape me." A tear slid down his cheek, the first emotion I had seen him allow himself to show. I loved her so much it consumed me. I could not imagine existing without her. And in trying to hold on to her so tightly, I crushed the very thing I loved. I set the letters down on the desk, my own tears falling freely now. "Do you see?" I asked softly. "Why I cannot allow history to repeat itself? I have a daughter who depends on me. I cannot become another Catherine, another woman lost to a love that demands everything and leaves no room to breathe." He looked at me with such anguish in his eyes that I nearly went to him. "Is that what you think I would do? That I would make the same mistakes? That I have learned nothing from her death?" "I do not know," I answered honestly. "I know you are capable of great kindness. I know you have shown me compassion when you had no obligation to do so. But I also know that love and possession can look very similar, and that good intentions are not always enough to prevent harm." We stood in the terrible silence that followed, and I felt something shifting between us, some delicate possibility beginning to crack. Then, to my surprise, he nodded slowly. "You are right to be afraid," he said. "You are right not to trust me easily. I have given you every reason to fear what I might become. But I am asking you, Eleanor, to give me the chance to prove that I can love differently, that I can love without consuming, that I have learned, through the worst pain imaginable, what it means to truly cherish another person's freedom as much as their presence." He stepped closer, but did not reach for me, respecting the distance I had placed between us. "I see you," he said quietly, "not as something fragile to be protected, but as someone strong who has survived what would have broken lesser souls. I see your courage, your dignity, your love for your daughter, and I am asking, not demanding, that you allow me to walk beside you, not as your keeper, but as your equal, not to build walls around you, but to help you tear down the ones that grief and circumstance have forced you to build around your own heart. I looked into his eyes and saw the truth there, the genuine remorse, the desperate hope, the willingness to be vulnerable. I saw a man who had been broken by his own mistakes and was trying, imperfectly, to become someone better. And I understood that loving him would be a risk, that there were no guarantees, that he might slip back into old patterns without meaning to. But I also understood that love always carries risk, and that the alternative, to lock my heart away forever, was its own kind of death. The ghost appeared then, standing in the corner of the library where shadows gathered. Catherine, pale and beautiful, watching us both. But this time her expression held something different. Not desperation, but a kind of benediction. She looked at me, and then at him, and I felt rather than heard her final message. Do not make my mistakes. Do not let fear masquerade as love, but do not let my tragedy prevent you from trying. And then she was gone, faded into the afternoon light, released at last from whatever had bound her to this house. I felt the air shift, felt something heavy and sad lift from the very stones of Thornfield Manor. She had been waiting, I understood, for this moment, for the Duke to finally acknowledge what he had done, and for me to hear him do it. I reached across the space between us and took his hand. It was warm and solid and trembling slightly. We would have to learn each other slowly. We would have to build trust carefully, brick by brick, with honesty and patience. There would be difficult days ahead, moments when old wounds reopened, times when we would have to choose love over fear, again and again. But we would try. We would both try. Spring came to Thornfield Manor like a promise kept, bringing with it pale sunlight that warmed the stones and coaxed green shoots from the earth that had seemed frozen forever. The house itself felt different, as though Catherine's departure had taken with it the weight of sorrow that had pressed down on every room and corridor. Windows were thrown open to let in fresh air. The staff moved with lighter steps. Even the dowager smiled more readily, and I caught her watching her son with an expression that might have been hope. The Duke kept his word. He did not demand or possess. Instead, he courted me the way a man courts a woman he respects, with patience and genuine interest in my thoughts and feelings. We walked together in the gardens as they bloomed back to life, and he listened when I spoke about my fears, my memories of my late husband, my concerns about raising Clara in a household so different from anything she had known. He did not dismiss those fears or try to solve them with grand gestures. He simply heard them, acknowledged them, and asked what he could do to make the path easier. He began to include Clara in our conversations, not as an afterthought, but as someone whose presence and happiness mattered to him. He taught her to identify birds in the garden, commissioned a dollhouse for her room, and never once suggested that she should be kept away or kept quiet. When she ran to him with scraped knees or excited discoveries, he knelt down to her level and gave her his full attention. I watched him with her and saw no impatience, no irritation at the disruption children naturally bring. I saw instead a man learning how to be part of a family, how to make space for noise and mess and the beautiful chaos of life. We spoke often of Catherine. He did not hide from her memory or pretend she had never existed. He spoke of the good times they had shared, the ways she had made him laugh, the dreams they had built together before his fear had poisoned everything. He spoke too of his mistakes, not seeking absolution, but simply acknowledging the truth. He visited her grave regularly, and sometimes I went with him, standing beside him in the quiet churchyard while he laid flowers and spoke words meant only for her. "I forgive you," I heard him say once, his voice breaking. "And I hope, wherever you are, that you have found the freedom I could not give you in life." I took his hand then, there among the headstones and the birdsong, and felt the last of the ghost's presence leave us. She was at peace. We were free to begin again. The proposal, when it came, was not what I might have expected from a duke. There was no grand display, no dramatic declaration before witnesses. Instead, it happened on an ordinary afternoon in the library, where we had spent so many hours in conversation. We were sitting by the window, reading in comfortable silence, when he set down his book and turned to me. "Eleanor," he said, and something in his tone made me look up. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." If you say no, nothing between us will change. I will continue to be your friend, and you will always have a home here, for yourself and for Clara. But if there is any part of you that could imagine a future with me, then I am asking you to be my wife." I set down my own book, my heart beating fast. "Tell me what that would mean," I said quietly. "Tell me what marriage to you would look like." He met my eyes steadily. "It would mean partnership. You would have your own income, your own accounts, money that is yours alone to spend or save as you wish. You would have freedom to visit friends, to travel, to pursue whatever interests bring you joy. I would consult you on decisions that affect our household. I would respect your judgment and your autonomy. I would try every day to be worthy of your trust, and when I fail, as I sometimes will, I would listen when you tell me so." He paused, then continued. "It would also mean that I would love you fiercely, that I would care about your happiness as much as my own, that I would protect you when protection is needed and step back when it is not. It would mean building a life together, you and I and Clara, with all the ordinary joys and sorrows that come with truly living. It would mean choosing each other every day, even when it is difficult. And if I say yes," I asked, "what happens to the memory of Catherine? What happens to your first wife? She will always be part of my past," he said simply. "I will always carry the weight of what happened, but she would not want me to stop living. I know that now. She would want me to love again, differently and better. She would want me to be happy, and I think, Eleanor, that you might be able to make me happy if you will let me try to do the same for you." I looked at this man who had shown me both the darkness and the light he was capable of, who had faced his worst mistakes and emerged willing to change, who had treated my daughter with kindness and me with respect. I thought of my late husband, of the love we had shared and lost, and I knew he would not have wanted me to remain frozen in grief forever. He had been a generous man, and he would have wanted me to live fully, to find joy again if I could. I thought of Clara, who deserved a stable home and a man who would be kind to her, who would give her opportunities I could never provide alone. I thought of myself, of the woman I had been before loss had carved away so much of my joy, and of the woman I might become if I allowed myself to hope again. "Yes," I said, and watched his face transform with relief and wonder. "Yes, I will marry you. Not because I need rescuing, but because I choose you. Because I believe you when you say you have learned. Because I think we might be able to build something good together, something honest and real." He reached for me then, and I went into his arms willingly, feeling the warmth of his embrace, the solid reality of him. We stayed there for a long time, holding each other in the spring sunlight, two people who had survived terrible losses and were brave enough to try again. The wedding was small and quiet, held in the chapel on the estate with only family and close household staff present. Clara stood beside me in a new dress, her face glowing with happiness. And when the Duke took my hand and spoke his vows, I heard the sincerity in every word. I spoke my own vows clearly, promising partnership and honesty, promising to speak when I needed space and to trust when he earned it, promising to build a marriage based not on possession, but on mutual respect. In the months that followed, we learned each other's rhythms and habits, the way all married couples must. There were moments of friction, times when old fears resurfaced or old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But we had promised honesty, and we kept that promise. When he became too protective, I told him, and he listened and adjusted. When I withdrew into myself, he asked what I needed, and I learned to answer. We stumbled sometimes, but we did not fall. Clara flourished in the safety and stability of Thornfield Manor. She ran through the halls with laughter, played in the gardens, and called the Duke Papa with an ease that made my heart swell. He was good to her, patient and present, never too busy to answer her questions or attend to her needs. I watched them together and felt grateful beyond measure that she would grow up knowing a father's love again. The house itself seemed to exhale, to settle into its stones with contentment. There were no more cold spots, no more whispers in empty rooms, no more footsteps in the night. Catherine's portrait hung in the gallery, beautiful and peaceful, a reminder of what had been lost, but also of what we had learned. We did not forget her. We honored her memory by living differently, by loving better, by refusing to let fear masquerade as devotion. On quiet evenings, when Clara was asleep and the house had settled into stillness, the Duke and I would sit together by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in each other's presence. Those were the moments I treasured most, the ordinary intimacy of two people who had chosen each other and were building something lasting from the ruins of their separate griefs. "I am happy," I told him one such evening, surprised by the truth of it. I did not think I would ever feel this way again. He looked at me with eyes that held tenderness and gratitude in equal measure. "Neither did I," he said softly. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn how to love without losing myself. Thank you for trusting me with your heart." I leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek, and thought of the long journey that had brought me here. From loss to survival, from survival to healing, from healing to this fragile, precious joy. It had not been an easy road, and there would be challenges ahead, but we would face them together, two imperfect people doing their best to honor the dead by living fully, by loving wisely, by building a future that held space for both remembrance and hope. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle and cleansing, washing away the last traces of winter's cold grip. And inside Thornfield Manor, in the warm circle of firelight, we sat together in peace, knowing that sometimes the greatest courage is not in holding on, but in learning when to let go, and then in daring to reach for something new.